Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning in today's EWC Seminars Live webinar, Global Civil Rights Activists Find Their Collective Voice. Our bi-monthly EWC Seminars Live series is designed for multinational journalists and informed audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories. My name is Liz A. Dorn, and I'm a program coordinator here at the center. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's panel of prominent academics and civil rights activists, sharing their thoughts on how the Black Lives Matter movement has connected millions of minorities around the world in fighting back against inequality, systemic racism, and police brutality. Dr. Adam Green is an associate professor of American history at the University of Chicago, where he teaches and researches African American and urban history, as well as social movements. Mr. D. Ray McKeeson is a leading voice in the U.S. Black Lives Matter movement and co-founder of Campaign Zero. He also hosts the award-winning podcast, Pod Save the People, which covers issues related to justice, equity, and identity. Dr. Melina Abdullah is among the original organizers who convened to form Black Lives Matter and continues to serve as a Los Angeles chapter lead. She is also professor of Pan-African Studies at California State University, Los Angeles. Ms. Sadia Mosba is a Tunis-based activist and the president of Menenti, an association that defends minorities in Tunisia. A community organizer behind the Black Lives Matter UK protests, Ms. Siana Bangura is the producer of 1500 and Counting, a documentary film investigating police brutality in the United Kingdom. Finally, Ms. Cheryl Axelby of Australia is not able to join us today due to a personal emergency. She sends her regrets. I would like to take a moment now to review our webinar protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off. Each panelist will speak for up to 10 minutes, and Q&A will take place after panelists' remarks. To submit a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and specify if there's a particular panelist you wish to answer. Kindly note that neither Sadia of Tunisia or Siana of the United Kingdom will be participating in the Q&A today due to the time zone difference. It's 3 a.m. there. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios and headshots, and YouTube links at www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities, as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. Finally, I'm honored to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Laniel Henderson. Dr. Henderson is an Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Public and International Affairs and the Assistant Dean of Public and International Affairs at the University of Baltimore. He is also the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Virginia State University. And with that, I hand over the program to Dr. Henderson to offer brief contextualizing remarks. Dr. Henderson.
Thank you very much, Liz. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for inviting us. We want to thank the East-West Center for being our host and for organizing this session, giving us an opportunity to meet each other. This discussion that we're having about Black Lives Matter around the world is the latest iteration of a movement that has been going on, or a set of movements that have been going on throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. So we can go all the way back to as early as the Niagara movement, organized by W.E.B. Du Bois in 1900. We can talk about the reiteration of that in 1944 by Dr. Du Bois and others who would become part of the leadership of the liberating forces for African independence against colonialism. We can go to everything from the Montgomery bus boycott to the sessions organized by CORE, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in the 1960s. We just laid to rest our beloved, John Lewis, who was in the forefront of that movement. Community-based organizations like the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, starting as a school lunch program and ending up as a community defense program. And then we can leap to the Black Power movement, organized by that Trinidadian American Stokely Carmichael Kwame Ture. And then we get into the 90s, where we see movements like the environmental justice movement in the early 90s, right up to this moment, where we acknowledge the killing and the maiming of more than 2,000 African Americans, mostly men, largely by not just white supremacist groups and racist groups, but by law enforcement. And so the Black Lives Matters movement takes us around the world to see protests, not only in the United States, but also in Australia, New Zealand, all over Europe, of course in Africa, and even in the Far East. So tonight, what we want to do is to engage you in a discussion led by a very distinguished group that has been introduced. And I want to get us right into this discussion by turning to our colleague, Professor Adam Green, at the University of Chicago. Everyone will speak for about 10 minutes. And then, as was explained, we will have the Q&A at the very end of all of those presentations. Professor Green.
Thank you very much, Dr. Henderson. And again, I'm grateful to the East-West Center for the opportunity to join this conversation, and particularly the distinguished panelists that are on this conversation, and looking forward to the questions and comments coming from those attending on the webinar. I want to be clear here that the number of panelists who are directly engaged in these struggles, I've engaged in some work here in Chicago, but there are others, colleagues, friends of mine, who really are the leaders of those chapters and those movements in Chicago. So my comments are really more to try to suggest some context in terms of thinking about what is powerful about particularly the Black Lives Matters movement, and in some ways what's unique. I agree with Dr. Henderson that this is something that comes out of a long legacy of Black struggle in this country and within the world. But I think there's some characteristics that also break out what is happening right now in the United States and elsewhere that speaks to the importance of this movement. One of these issues is the redefinition of racial violence as predominantly state violence. If we stop and think about the ways in which the legend of the problem of racial violence in the United States is often told, it's a phenomenon of personal violence in relation to thinking about killings, targetings on the part of people seeking to keep African Americans in subordination, the work of associations, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan, of course, or specific incidents of racial violence that took place relatively recently. The killing of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia earlier this year, Trayvon Martin in Florida in 2012, or the death of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas back in 1998. But one of the things that I think Black Lives Matters has begun to really show a spotlight to and make an argument far more powerfully in some ways than the many people who've studied and researched this have been able to, is that racial violence as a means of control is, for the most part, now something that happens through agents of the state rather than private actors or associations. And this is something that really underscores the ways in which one can see racism's systemic character, and the ways in which this society, American society, is really rent with contradictions around claiming on the one hand racial egalitarianism, while at the same time practicing some of the most overt forms of anti-Blackness. Think, for instance, in this context about the survey project by the British newspaper The Guardian, launched in 2016, that found that out of 1,093 Americans who were killed by police use of force that year, 293 were African Americans. That resulted in a per capita rate of death of close to 7 per million in the African American community, twice the rate for whites and Latinos, and nearly 6 times the rate for Asian Americans. It's important to note that these were figures that were put together through sourcing through journalism and community group sources and reports. Neither local nor national law enforcement keeps reliable statistics in terms of racial breakdowns in relation to deaths at the hand of law enforcement. It's also important here to understand the context around this violence that relates to, on the one hand, the disproportionate violence directed against African Americans, and then the inverse enforcement effects of arrest, conviction, and sentencing of Blacks as compared to whites and other groups. A 2018 report by the Sentencing Project that was given to the United Nations found that African American adults were 6 times as likely to be incarcerated as white citizens. They comprise 27% of individuals arrested in the United States, more than twice their share of the population, and were far more prevalent to be given the death penalty than whites were. From 2002, this study extrapolated, 1 in 3 African-American males could expect to serve some time within the penal system. The comparable figure for Latinos was 1 in 6. The comparable figure for white males was 1 in 17. And in a sense, no single case illustrates these disparities better than the case of George Zimmerman, the accused shooter of Trayvon Martin back in 2012. It was his acquittal, after all, that compelled first Alicia Garza in Oakland and later Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi to tweet out Black Lives Matters, which in the wake of the Ferguson, Missouri unrest in 2014 grew into a movement that included 30 chapters by 2016 across the United States. The second point that I think is a difference and a distinction in terms of what is happening in relation to Black Lives Matters is the way in which there's a building out of what people conventionally refer to as a civil rights struggle or an equality struggle within the United States to fully foreground the principle of Black freedom. These movements, to be sure, are still seeking legal and political protections or trying to assert rights, and in some cases are cultivating allies within political leadership, albeit more often in local context rather than national government. But it's crucial to note the ways in which BLM is pushing for self-determination, more so than inclusion, for freedom, more so than equal protection of rights. In my sense, this is not because of a sense of not seeing merit in seeking those qualities, but rather there's an understanding and a recognition of the ways in which US society as presently constituted may not be capable of delivering racial equality, nor divesting itself of anti-Blackness as a public norm. And you can see this in the number of the different measures that are important, both in terms of policy and stated program. Not only ones that have to do with reforms in government, but a commitment to principles of restorative justice, principles of self-care, principles of small-scale community building. And I think here, thinking about some of the controversies that came up, not now in the period of the Trump administration, but during the Obama administration around the decision of some members to maintain a stance of non-engagement with the government, especially in the wake of the Ferguson uprising from 2014 and going on into 2016. Again, this is not, as I understand it, intended as a dismissal of the civil rights era and its legislative accomplishments, but rather as an unsentimental conclusion that those gains have been shown to be susceptible to being rolled back in relation to the ways in which they signify a direction on the part of the larger nation. And one only need to think about the larger context of the turn of the 20th century into the 21st century, with affirmative action being rolled back as national law and policy. In 2013, with the Shelby versus Holder decision that severely reduced the enforcement power of the Voting Rights Act, passed in 1965. And most recently, the emergence of a sizable sector of the white American electorate that seems to be committed to the exercise of racial authority, if not the principle of inherent racial supremacy. These are things that really justify this sense of skepticism about how far, in fact, American society, as currently constituted, can deliver in relation to racial amelioration and racial reform. And I think it's important here to note that the racial disparities associated with the COVID-19 crisis in the US similarly underscore the ways in which BLM, like a number of other groups, is presenting a larger critique and maybe even indictment of American society. A late May study conducted by several organizations and researchers from prominent US universities and advocacy groups found that African Americans up to that point in late May made up over half of the coronavirus diagnoses, cases, and deaths in the United States, despite, of course, their far smaller share of the population. That figure has gone down, of course, since the pandemic has reached predominantly white states in the Midwest and Plains this past summer. But Black deaths are still projected to account for nearly a quarter of American fatalities. And as various researchers ranging from Jennifer Tsai in Scientific America to Merlin Chokwanyun and Adolph Reed in the New England Journal of Medicine argue, this is evidence of the impact of racism rather than race as some imprint of nature or physical constitution. The existence of comorbidities, or the prevalence of comorbidities, such as diabetes and heart disease, as well as disparities in the scope, level, and quality of medical care, have particularly underscored the ways in which this disease is tracking according to the adverse effect of unequal life circumstances related to race within the US. The third contextual point that I would suggest is the significance, the importance of understanding the ways in which leaderless organizing and full intersectional solidarity and recognition are serving as guiding principles and really breakthroughs in some ways in terms of broad movement organizing for Black Lives Matters. Prior mobilizations against racism within the United States, and here I would include the civil rights movement in its classic phase during the 1960s, realized great successes, but at the same time, they struggled with how inequities within those movements, as opposed to those outside that they were struggling against, undercut their capacity to institute sufficient social change. Homophobia, misogyny, class elitism, all created dynamics that reduced the ranks at times of supporters, but also raised contradictions challenging the moral authority of leaders and programs. And I think this is one of the things that's most important to address and consider in relation to Black Lives Matters. The ways in which its organizing has come out of roots in Black queer activism, it turned coming out in part to the response to the prior pandemic of HIV/AIDS, and also the critical example of radical Black feminism from the 1970s and 80s in terms of suggesting different modes of leadership, different modes of thinking about organizing communities. In that sense, I think the sort of push to present an alternative to charismatic, solitary leadership and thinking about the ways in which responsibility and organizing capacity is spread across wide sets of people is something that's very important to note within Black Lives Matters. And this likely is one of the reasons why we see the kind of scope and spread of this movement. Over 4,000 cities and towns worldwide, involving between 15 and 26 million people within the United States. Over the past 3 months, arguably the most successful and most massive mass movement in American history. So these are just some suggestions in terms of the contextual significance of this movement, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very comprehensive, and we thank you very much. And we want to transition immediately to D-Ray Michelson from Baltimore. D-Ray, are you there?
Yep. It's an honor to be here. I am from Baltimore. I still live in Baltimore. It's a great place. I was one of the original protesters in the street in Ferguson in 2014. We were in the street for 400 days. It was a long 400 days. Since then, we have learned so much more about the way that systems and structures protect the police. We carried one simple truth with us in the street every night, and that was that Mike Brown should be alive, and that spread all across the country. One of the most beautiful things about the protests when they began and as they continue is that you didn't need to be a member of an organization to be a protester. You didn't have to have a chapter. You didn't have to have a team. You joined a community, and being in community with other people was actually greater than any of those other ways that we have been told were the only ways to organize. When I think about in the street then, when I think about Baltimore, when I think about all the cities that I've been to supporting the work of organizers and protesters and activists, one of the most beautiful things is that there is space for everybody. And there's some people who do believe in a membership-based way of organizing. There are people who don't. There are people who believe in a range of things, but the common thread is that all of us believe in community. And we know that there are many ways that you can get to community. Now, what I want to talk about are what are the outcomes and sort of what are strategies. So we always think about, in Kim we think about our strategy threefold. One is reduce the power of the police. So examples of this are like use of force, like when they can use force, it's the police union contracts. These are mechanisms to today reduce their power to do harm in community and just reduce the power in general as it might hurt us. The second is shrinking the role of the police. So divesting, you might know it as defund, alternatives to the police, however you think about it. But this is dramatically shrinking the role of the police in society. And the third is undoing mass incarceration. And I call that out specifically because the reason why the scope of the police is so big is that we built the carceral state to be so massive. Now, what's important to remember is that all of these are both and, not either or, that there is no one strategy that'll get us to zero. There's no one strategy that'll help us move away from the police as key to public safety. It will take a host of strategies all working in concert with each other to get us there. When we think about this question of how do you eat an elephant, we know that the answer is one bite at a time. Now, there's one version of that that says one bite after another, which is incrementalism. And I don't think many of us believe that. There's another version that says many people biting all at the same time. And that is the strategy that we think about. Now, what's important to remember is that the police have killed consistently since 2014. There is no year after 2014 where the police have killed less than 2014. A lot of people think that it got better just because they didn't see it on the news in 16 and 17. But again, it did not get better. The violence of the police is pretty consistent. What's also important to remember is that we have no data at the national level before 2013. So if you got killed by a police officer before then, we don't have a way to capture it. And if you get killed by a police officer today in the United States and a media report does not write about it, then you don't exist in any of the three databases. Now, this is the Washington Post, and I'll talk to you about why the Washington Post data matters in a minute. But if you look at the black line, that's 2019. If you look at the orange line, that is 2020. The police have killed at the same rates through COVID, through quarantine, through the last of the protests. The police have just been pretty consistent. And I say that because we use the data to help us understand and remember what solutions look like, where solutions have to be, and one way to think about what progress looks like. What also a lot of people don't realize is that the police actually kill more people in suburban communities than almost all other communities combined. There's a decrease in police violence resulting in death happening in cities, about a 30% decrease since 2013, since the first data that we have. It's important that we acknowledge that, but we don't celebrate it, right? There's still people getting killed in cities, and there's still a problem. But it's important to remember that Kenosha, where Jacob Blake was shot, is more representative of where the problem is across the country than not. Wauwatosa is another town in Wisconsin, 50,000 people in Wauwatosa. There's one officer who has killed 3 people in the past 5 years. He is also the only officer who's killed anybody in Wauwatosa in the past 5 years. He got a Medal of Honor for killing the first person. He got suspended for killing the second, and he is under investigation for the third. But it's those sort of places where people don't think about. Baltimore is a really good example. Baltimore City looks like this, county looks like this. Baltimore City gets the news about being a dangerous city and The Wire, and like that's the narrative about it. A lot of people don't realize that Baltimore County, it is the suburbs, it is the Baltimore County Police Department that has killed more people in 2020 than any other place in Maryland, and more people in 2019 than any other county in the state of Maryland. It's not Baltimore City. So again, the data reminds us about that. And what's important here too is that if you look at the news sometimes, you would think that the whole country is just 2 cities, and it's not. So part of the storytelling work that reporters need to do, that the media needs to do, is help shine a light on these towns. There are 18,000 police departments. And if we don't tell the story and focus in places where the problem is most acute, we'll never win. Now, this is just a snapshot. There are 3 big databases of police violence. There are 3 in the country. We don't count the federal government because the federal government does not release department level data or incident level data. So it's not helpful. They just do roll up data at the aggregate. So the Washington Post, we like the Post. The challenge with the Post database is that they only include on-duty killings that include a gun. So this means that George Floyd's not in that database because he was not killed with a gun. They also code you as armed if you had anything in your hand at the time of death. So Tamir Rice, for instance, is still coded as armed in their database. Fatal encounters, great database too. Challenge with fatal encounters is that they count a host of things. So you can't just pull a raw number out of the database about police killings. They include death by suicide, for instance. They include people who die in the presence of the police, not necessarily police killings. So we started mapping police violence in 2013, an activist-led database of police violence in the United States. It's the only database that's all on duty, off duty, all weapons, where an officer was actively involved in the death of another person. I'll just let you look at this for a second. There are only 12 days this year so far. We did this, we lasted this at the end of August, where a police officer has not killed anybody. If you look at March and April and May, those were the quarantine months. And again, it has still been consistently bad in those months. I worry sometimes that the public narrative that people see the magazines and they see the TV shows, they see the interviews, they see the internet or Instagram or Twitter, and they think that that must mean progress. But we are always mindful that awareness, that people understanding the problem does not necessarily mean that the problem is actually changing in any capacity. This is important to remember on the right, that there are 8 cities where a Black man is more likely to be killed by a police officer than anyone is likely to be murdered by anyone. And what's important about this is that these are not the cities that people think of. People don't think about Reno and Oklahoma City and Anaheim when they think about the problem being acute. But we focus on these because when people talk about national solutions, when people lead this conversation, especially at the national level, if the solutions will not reach a Reno, if they won't matter in an Oklahoma City, if they don't help in a Santa Ana, if the strategy doesn't reach an Anaheim, then it won't be a strategy that helps us win. Now, you already know that Black people are more likely to be killed. What a lot of people don't know is that Black people are actually more likely to be unarmed than white people. It's a myth that Black people are running around with guns, shooting the police. Remember that the leading cause of death amongst police for this year is actually COVID, but normal years outside of the pandemic, it's actually death by suicide. It is not by anything that the public has done. And I'll just quickly show you this. On the left-hand side is the cities with the highest rate of police violence in the United States. So we account for population, so it's the rates per 1 million. Again, you look at this, it's Phoenix. In Phoenix, 1 in 5 homicides a couple of years ago was committed by an officer. In Albuquerque, it was 1 in 3 homicides was committed by an officer. We look at the places so that we can help people understand like where it is acute and where it might not be as acute given the public conversation. And on the right-hand side is a visual representation of people who are unarmed by race. As another way to show you that Black people, Latinx people are more likely to be unarmed in the presence of the police, not the other way around. And I will show you this as I close. So just as a primer is that there are structures that allow for officers to almost never be disciplined, to not be held accountable, for the budgets not to change, for there to be a status quo as the stasis. And I say this because the police know that often the result of the protest will result in an officer being dismissed or something, but rarely results in structural change. So that becomes the battle. This is a good example of how a structure is protecting police. Remember, almost no officers get convicted of anything. About 1% get convicted of any crime when they kill people, which is sort of wild. And I'll stop here. So in 2015, we put together these 10 buckets. We were like, there's not a lot of data. There was no data really in 2015 when we started this. And we were like, here's what we think matters. Here's what we've learned since then. 5, 6, and 7 don't matter. I'm not going to talk about 1, 2, 4, 8, 9 just because they are sort of like things we believe. We don't have a project about them. Broken windows policing is low-level arrest. That is bad. Community oversight. The community should oversee everything. Independent investigation just makes sense. For-profit policing is like civil asset forfeiture, and demilitarization is giving military weapons to the police. But 5, 6, and 7, so 6, the single biggest study of body cameras shows that body cameras don't change police behaviors, they do change police attitudes. So doesn't have the effect that people think. Training, the 2 big studies of training, implicit bias and mental health training don't change police behaviors at all. And the community representation, the percentage of Black officers does matter, but it doesn't matter until the department's over 35% Black. There are only 10 police departments in the top 100 that are over even 30% Black. So if that was a solution, it's not a scalable solution. And the community policing, we think, is actually a racist idea, that it's only Black and brown people, that we'd ever say that the police actually should spend more time with them to treat them like human beings, to treat us like whole people. So we found that use of force rules really do matter. Police union contracts, are a huge factor in blocking budgets changing. So Seattle tried to cut the budget, a big cut. They were blocked by the police union contract. There are host of cities, Columbus, Louisville. There are cities across the country where the police union contract actually is the single biggest lever standing in our way from being able to get the systemic change that we deserve. The last thing I'll say is that I believe that we can win in this lifetime. I don't think that I'm working on a 200-year solution. The people I'm around don't think we're working on something that'll take that long. We think that we can win in this lifetime. And we also know that if the structures don't change, the outcomes won't change.
We deeply appreciate it. And we want to turn now to Dr. Melina Abdullah at Cal State Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Definitely looking forward to this conversation, especially the Q&A portion. I'm going to share as much as I can, first about the history of Black Lives Matter, but then about this moment, this particular moment when we believe that the world has cracked wide open and we can transform the world we live in, not just tinker around the edges of a system of policing that was meant deliberately and intentionally to design to produce the outcomes that it does. So this is not an accident that Black people are killed by police. It often sounds to some like a radical statement to say that policing evolves from slave catching, but it absolutely does evolve from slave catching. And so the targets placed on the backs of Black people are not accidental, they are deliberate. And so it's important that we understand that Black Lives Matter emerged after George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. And Dr. Green begins to mention this, that many of us in cities around the country, especially in Los Angeles, rose up and said that we have to resist. We have to make sure that we don't just approach this as episodic organizing, right? But we have to build a movement, not a moment. And so that's what Alicia Garza was writing in her love letter to Black people. That's what Patrisse Cullors began to hashtag. And then on the third day of protest, she called many of us who were out in the streets doing intuitive organizing, shutting it down on Crenshaw, and shutting it down on the 10 freeway, and shutting down the new Expo line in Los Angeles, and marching to Hollywood and Highland. On the third day of protest, Patrisse Cullors called us together and had us kind of pledge this building of a movement, not a moment. And the 30 of us who were gathered in her courtyard fairly naively said, yes, we're committing our lives to this, but didn't realize it would become the largest movement in not just US history, but now they're estimating in global history. And so we feel summoned into this work by the Black radical tradition, by the long history of Black freedom struggle that's been noted. We understand that we are not the first people to be doing this work, but if we are to say that we descend from Yaa Asantewaa, that we descend from Harriet Tubman, that we descend from Mama Ida B. Wells and Ella Baker, then we have to do this work. We have to commit ourselves wholly and fully to doing this work. And so what we've seen happen is some of the data that was presented is really, really important data. And I just want to underscore some of what was said, that the collection of data is hugely problematic. And especially when you're calling on policing units, on law enforcement units to collect and share their own data, they're of course doing so in ways that benefit them, right? So they are excluding data that does not include shootings, right? So as D. Ray mentioned, the murder of George Floyd would not be considered a police killing because he wasn't shot to death, right? We're also seeing in custody deaths not included. So when we think about people who die in custody rather than as a result of an actual shooting, they are not counted in that number. So I'm thinking about people like Sandra Bland and Waukesha Wilson and John Horton, right? We can also think about people who do not die immediately, but might have been shot and then take a few days to pass away. Their numbers are not counted. And so in Los Angeles, what we've done is go painstakingly through all media reports, as well as all online reports, as well as through the open justice system that was actually created by Kamala Harris when she was Attorney General. And we've created a website called prosecutekillercops.org, prosecutekillercops.org. We believe that it's not just the names of those who've been killed that we have to uplift and honor, but the names of those who kill that we have to reveal to the public, because as was shared, very rarely and almost never are police held accountable for the brutality and killings that they exact on our communities. So Prosecute Killer Cops shares the name Michael Robbins, who shot Kenneth Ross Jr. in his 4th shooting in Gardena, California, right? It shares the name Eden Medina and the picture of Eden Medina, who killed 14-year-old Jesse Romero, an Afro-Latino 14-year-old boy who hadn't even made it to high school yet, just 12 days after he killed Omar Gonzalez. We believe that these kinds of officers are dangers to our community, and the community should be put on alert. We also know that what we're facing is much bigger than a set of bad apples. It's much bigger than problematic officers. It's systems that were intentionally and deliberately designed to produce these outcomes. And so we have to have systemic-based responses. And so what Black Lives Matter does is attempt to hold policing units, police associations who parade themselves around as unions, which are not unions, but parade themselves around as unions. We hold them accountable. We also hold elected officials accountable who take police money. And we attempt to hold the entire system, what Dr. Yusef Salaam calls the criminal system of injustice, accountable, recognizing that district attorney's office, many times coroner's offices, are all complicit in the murder of Black people at the hands of police. Finally, what we do is really grassroots-based power building. So we do have policy work that we do. We've passed some very meaningful legislation and are attempting to breathe life into the Breathe Act, which we hope everyone will check out, which is really taking on the frame of Black Lives Matter, recognizing that you can't simply tinker around the edges of a fundamentally unjust system, but you have to abolish that system and build a reimagined system of public safety. So we do have public policy work that we engage in. We do engage in traditional forms of change, but we also know that no group has ever voted themselves into freedom. And the real power of transformation comes from people being on the ground, doing work on the ground. So we don't move from protest to politics, despite the brilliant work of political scientists like Catherine Tate, who says that that's the way that we move. We don't move in that way. We must move from protest. We must move with protest and politics, right? And so it's the people on the ground that are forcing change. It is our voices that are important. It's important that we wrap our arms around the families who speak most powerfully for their loved ones. I'm thinking about what's happening right here in Los Angeles, and D-Ray is right. There's a lot of rural areas and suburban areas that are neglected, but we have to think about urban centers like Los Angeles, where more people are killed by police violence than any other place in this country. And because our policing units invest heavily in PR systems, they simply sweep those murders under the rug. Many of you have never heard of Dejan Kazee, who was just killed on Monday night, stopped because he was biking while Black and given a vehicle code violation for riding a bicycle. And I mean Monday day. The protests began Monday night. We've been protesting for him for the last 8 days. Many of you don't know his name. Many of you don't know the name Jesse Romero or John Horton or Kenneth Ross Jr. or Grishario Mack, who was gunned down inside the Crenshaw Baldwin Hills Mall as he asked for help in the midst of a mental health challenge. And instead they sent in police with quote unquote every gun blazing, shot him until he fell to the ground. And even while he was still alive on the floor, they stood over his body and shot 2 more fatal shots until he was dead. Many of you don't know the name Albert Ramon Dorsey, who was shot naked inside a 24-hour fitness. And so we have to uplift the names and empower communities and empower those families, but also remember that I could be the mother of 16-year-old AJ Weber. I have a 16-year-old. And so all of us are called together, and we use, I heard Dr. Green talk about this concept of a leaderless movement. We are not leaderless, we are leaderful. And that is grounded in the principle that is lifted up by Mama Ella Baker of group-centered leadership rather than leader-centered groups. We understand that when people come together, we have the ability to transform, not just reform things, to reimagine, not just take for granted that what is what has to be. And I'll stop there, and thank you so much for this time.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Abdullah, especially for bringing to our attention the most recent instances of police murder right there in the Los Angeles area. Thank you so much. And I now want to turn to our next panelist, Saida Mosbah, who's the president of McKinney in Tunis.
Hello, everybody. General presentation of MEMTI and Tunisia. Tunisia is located in the north of the African continent. This part of Africa called White is a country of about 12 million inhabitants, where the black population varies between 10 and 15%, according to the studies made by some historians and anthropologists about 40 years ago. My country, Tunisia, officially abolished slavery in 1846, but black Tunisians have moved over time from slavery to servitude. Tunisia gave its names to the continent, Ifriqiya, but it's not concerned by her Africanity. MEMTI Association, which means my dream, was born in 213, after the Tunisian Revolution. We work to fight against racial, cultural, and religious segregation, as well as to defend the rights of minorities through cultural activity. The defense and promotion of the cultural identity of Black in Tunisia through studies and research of minority, as well as the promotion of their cultural heritage, their rights, and their economic and social situation. We work for the propagation of a culture of brotherhood, of peace and justice, based in the universal principle of humanity. To begin with, it's important to say and stress that the demonstration of June 6th was a message of support to our African American brothers and sisters, a message of solidarity from continent. Your sorrow and your sufferings are also ours. The people who manifested and who demonstrated are those enrolled in the order of human rights. Modernists, Democrats, they are not only black. We noted that only black modernists joined this movement. The profound Tunisian society gave no interest to this movement and had taken it a new item. Few or not articles in the local written press, no statements by political parties, and also no outrage, indignation on the part of the society association, which are usually very reactive. We observed, however, the involvement of young people, and even very young people, in social networks and various events for young high school students and students under the title of Black Lives Matter. The demonstrations were also a reminder and warning for the Tunisian authorities and the current political class, which voted in October 218 a law relating to the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. This law, which commits the Tunisian states to put in place and set policies, strategies, and action plans to prevent this scourge. The state is also committed to expanding the culture of human rights, equality, tolerance, and acceptance of others among the components of society. Article 3, Law 15. But unfortunately, nothing at all this had not been done yet. Can we really talk about the Black movement in Tunisia? Not yet able to define Black action, as it's still in the commencements. A little look at history takes us back to the United States and South Africa, where racism was expressed in a form of apartheid, and where people were in the clashes with the social, political, and legal order. In Tunisia, everything has been done to draw out the social, which is fundamental, and to develop a political opinion which reveals a social uniqueness. The Black problem is fundamentally socio-cultural and historical. In our collective imagination, we are racist, but not politically and legally segregationist. If we have a glimpse back to the political inclusion, the legislature is totally indifferent to the Black problem in Tunisia. And even worse, as bringing up this problem can lead to social protest that present-day Tunisia is not able to contain. The inclusion of Black Tunisian and sub-Saharan migrants remains a red line not to be crossed and a taboo, and issue still adjourned for better days. Meanwhile, the Black Tunisian remains invisible in the total marginalization, and even the societal effort excludes his cause. It's important to stress that the majority of Black Tunisians do not consider themselves as a minority and refuse this designation. We are component of the Tunisian social fabric. We have the same rights and the same duties. So there is no reason not to see them in the political and cultural landscape of Tunisian society. I must include, although all the efforts, migrants and sub-Saharans does not have any legal status in Tunisia. Our short and medium-term objectives as an association that mobilize actors of favor of promotion of condition in Black in Tunisia. We are in action to revile, sensitize, and motivate, and make Blacks themselves aware that they must be active players in the future for their children. And finally, we are working so that Tunisia recognizes its Africanity, its multiculturality, and its multi-ethnicity. We thank you for your attention.
All right, have we concluded there? Excellent presentation. I'm sorry that she's not here in person, but we have a wonderful presentation from her. And we certainly affirm, applaud, and act on the things that she's mentioned here that have also been mentioned by our other panelists. And with that, we want to go to our next panelist, who I believe also is pre-recorded, and that's Sania Bangura, who's a producer of 1500 and Counting, writer, and she's been introduced, and we go to her now.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Mahalo to everybody, and thank you so much for having me as part of this esteemed lineup of speakers. I am so sorry that I can't be there with you live. The time zones would not allow. I would have been with you at an absolutely horrifying hour, and so instead I am giving you this pre-recorded version of my talk. My name is Sania Bangura, and I am a writer, a producer, a community organizer, among many other things. And I am going to give some short insight into why the Black Lives Matter movement has had such an impact in the UK. So the first thing to note is that whatever happens in the USA has global reverberations always. The USA has big cultural, political, social influence. And so we in the UK are not exempt from feeling that influence. And when we think about this Black Lives Matter moment and this movement, it's really important to think about the fact that we are also dealing with a pandemic context, a blueprint that we've never had before. So a famous quote that we've all seen throughout this period is the idea of this pandemic being a portal. And in many ways it has been. This pandemic has given us space to bear witness, probably for the first time for many people, bear witness, connect the dots, and really think about what it means to be anti-racist, to really think about what it means to literally have a foot on your neck, to literally think about what it means to be a Black person in this world, in this time, always. In England and Wales, the police are reportedly 3 times more likely to arrest a Black person than a white person. They are 5 times more likely to use force, and Black people are 40 times more likely to be stopped and searched than white people. How is that even possible? This time, things have felt more urgent and more grassroots. We've had a Black Lives Matter movement before, but again, not in a pandemic context. Disproportionate force used against Black people is often what leads to deaths in custody and immediately following police contact. Since 1990, there have been over 1,743 deaths in England and Wales of people following police contact, according to the charity Inquest. So the pandemic has given us this moment to really take that in, to think about the fact that there have been over 1,700 deaths in custody or immediately following police contact, to see that in broad daylight, a police officer can execute somebody and be so brazen as to think there will be no consequences for this. We are seeing that, as well as this deadly pandemic that is COVID-19, we're also navigating, and have always navigated, the deadly pandemic that is racism. People from Black and ethnic minority groups in the UK have not only been hit harder financially during this crisis, thanks to disproportionate numbers of Black people working in precarious jobs in the UK, but inequality literally kills. In this country, Black women are 4.3 times more likely than white women to die from the virus. And Black men are 4.2 times more likely to die. Now, context. In the last census, which was in 2011, Black people accounted for just 3.3% of the population of England and Wales. Yet we are overrepresented in every poverty statistic, from education to housing to healthcare to under and unemployment, imprisonment, and every lack of opportunity statistic going. And let's not forget that Black women are 5 times more likely to die during pregnancy or childbirth in the UK than their white counterparts. Black children are more likely to be permanently excluded from school. What a litany of failure at every level of the state. And there is still major denial, major cognitive dissonance in the UK. The UK and British people do not want to accept Britain's historic and present leading role as the great exporter of racism and white supremacy across the world. There is piss poor education when it comes to Britain's colonial past. There is piss poor education when it comes to history. I mean, let me just give you a little more context for a moment. So there was a YouGov survey that took place in 2014. And at the time, 59% of Brits thought the British Empire was something to be proud of rather than ashamed of. And then in 2016, a similar poll was done again, and still 44% of people were proud of the British Empire. So the numbers were still as high as that. Why would you be proud of something that waged terrorism across the globe, that destroyed the lives of countless thousands, millions of people, that has meant that Black and brown diasporas are forever scattered across the globe? You would be proud of that because you do not know your history. And so it's only now that we're seeing statues tumble and fall, and we're hearing conversations about decolonizing our curriculum hit the mainstream. And the amount of times I and other Black people have found ourselves gaslighted by white people, told that these things are in the past, and that Black people have a chip on our shoulders and we should be grateful for being in England. Well, actually, we don't have a chip on our shoulders. We have a whole foot on our neck, and we have had for hundreds and hundreds of years. People, my people, were forcibly brought to this island to build this nation with their blood, sweat, tears, and very breath. And so there is nothing for us to be grateful for. This country owes Black people everything. And speaking of rebuilding this country, let us never forget the ongoing Windrush scandal. And then there's the Grenfell Tower tragedy in 2017. One big message of this moment is that the UK is not innocent. You see that hashtag everywhere. And what this means is that the UK and British people have to wake up to the fact that we are complicit, not just complicit, but we play a leading role when it comes to exporting white supremacy and racism across the globe, and we always have done. Everything that the USA knows, it learned from its racist parent, Britain. In the UK, British people are very pleased to pass the buck and to say, well, you know, things might be bad here if they even acknowledge that they're bad here. But at the end of the day, we're not as bad as the USA, passing the buck and using the USA as this barometer of oppression. And I mean, if the USA is your barometer of if you're doing well, come on now, it's pretty low bar, let's face it, an outright racist nation with an outright racist president, that can't be your barometer of success in any way, shape or form. And yet, it is. People feel very comfortable to say, well, you know, racism isn't the same here. You know, even if that was the case, a little bit of racism is still racism, all right? Just because it may not seem like we have overt forms of racism in the way that we see in the US, we still have covert forms of racism. And actually, in the UK, people, you know, like myself included, have experienced overt forms of racism, as well as the embedded, the institutionalized, the underhand types of racism that we've come to be used to. So the UK is not innocent. It has blood on its hands. It has blood on its buildings, its money, its very way of life, and its very foundations. It has the blood of people like Sheku Bayo, people like Sarah Reid, people like Sean Rigg, Mzee Mohammed, Christopher Alder, Cherry Groves, the victims of the 1981 New Cross fire, and so on and so forth. The list is long and absolutely damning. And just like staff in our National Health Service, the NHS, and other key workers need PPE, not claps and badges, Black people need to see an end to systemic oppression in each and every way that it manifests in this country and globally. And whilst we're at it, just as we're moving away from archaic ideas such as political Blackness, something very specific to the UK context, we must also abolish terms such as BAME. So BAME is Black and Minority Ethnic, a term used again in the UK in things like the census. Black and brown people are the world's global majority. And so we should be treated as such. We should see ourselves as such. Even the fact that language matters so deeply is something that gets lost. To constantly be referred to as a minority creates this minority complex, right? And so Black people in the UK and globally need to always remember that we're actually part of a global majority. And we're demanding not just equity, we're demanding justice and transformation, not handouts and empty words, empty gestures, because in the UK, I mean, the UK is the world leader in empty gestures. I want to see more people in the UK talking about things like defunding the police and prison abolition, because actually in the UK context, this does make sense too. The the UK does have a prison industrial complex, not just the USA. 56 years since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the USA, and 55 years since the 1965 Race Relations Act in the UK, we are still saying something as basic as Black Lives Matter. And films like mine, 1,500 and counting, are still needing to be made. May this be the generation that brings us justice. May this be the last generation that has to deal with this absolute madness. And on the question of who else is involved in this movement in the UK, right? At the end of the day, the calls for freedom are often led, if not always, led by Black people, particularly Black women, Black queer people, Black trans people, Black gender non-conforming people. And it's really important to note that change never comes from the top down, it comes from the bottom up. So when the most marginalized in society are lifted, we all are lifted with them. And so when Black people rise, we bring everybody with us, right? And in this moment, we can see that this call for Black Lives Matter isn't just resonating with, you know, white people who see themselves as progressive and who want to learn to be anti-racist. You've got a lot of non-Black people of color also taking heed. Now, although it seems that the wave of Black Lives Matter has happened and we, at least in the UK, are on the other side of it, we're now in kind of what would be considered the quieter period. This is the moment where your true colors will show. This is what we're really gonna, this is when we're really gonna see what you're made of. We're really gonna see if you're gonna pull up like you said that you would, or were you just involved in the hype? And were you just involved when it was trendy? These are the questions that people need to ask themselves, particularly white people and other people of color who are not Black. I know that in this audience, there are a lot of journalists. So you need to be asking yourself the kind of questions about how are you reporting with regards to Black lives in your country? How are you reporting the Black Lives Matter moment? How are you contributing to the archiving? How are you contributing to certain positive or negative narratives? You need to ask yourself that question. As I said, may this be the generation of justice, the generation that ends all of this, because every generation has its problems. And I think it would be wonderful if we could have new problems, not the same problems that generations upon generations upon generations have had to deal with. We are dealing with the pandemic that is COVID-19, whilst also grappling with the pandemic of racism. And I really hope that whatever felt different about this moment comes to pass, and that something the kind of transformation that we deserve is what we see. So I just want to thank you all once again for having me and for, you know, having some space to listen to, I suppose, the UK context from my point of view. And again, just mahalo, take care everybody. And I hope that, you know, one day I'll actually make it to Hawaii.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We've heard some wonderful, insightful, data-driven, experience-driven presentations. And now it's time to hear from our audience. We have several questions that have been directed to specific members of the panel, and I'm going to direct those questions to them. The first question is for Dr. Abdullah, and the question is, do you think there is a systemic reason that police departments, and by extension police unions, of the most progressive cities in the US seem to be the most opposed to reform?
I don't know that I would say that the police associations, which I refuse to call unions because they do not represent the interests of working class people. They represent the narrow interests of their members, right? So police associations, I don't know if I would call them more problematic in big cities like mine, like Los Angeles. I think that they're larger and have a larger number of members, a larger base of support, and more money in their coffers. And I think that that's an issue. I think that when you talk about how police associations in Los Angeles join forces with police associations up and down a state like California that has so many officers, I think that's one of the reasons why you see public policy that's particularly problematic. So people sometimes go, how could it be that California is one of only 5 states without a police decertification process? Well, there's more police in California. There's more organized members, and there's more money to back up one of the worst and most problematic, POBAR is one of the most problematic police protections in the country. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
I'll just add about
Thank you both for the question and for the response.
I just want to add something about the police.
Did I hear another comment, D-Ray, that you want to comment on that?
About the police unions, the police groups, is that one of the things that we have to remember is that all unions, right? Like what unions do is bargain over wages, health insurance, things like that. It's normally something that costs money. And what the police did that was really insidious is that from the 50s to the 80s, there were all these cities, a lot of big cities that were experiencing budget decreases, and the budgets were strapped. So the police went in and they were like, you know what? We're not going to ask for any more increases. We're not going to ask for anything that costs money. So what they did is that they asked for all these wilder things. So they were like, you know what, destroy our disciplinary records, make the disciplinary panel 3 police officers. They got all these incredibly wild wins in a very concentrated period of time. And it's just hard to get it out now because, you know, it's just hard because of bargaining. And it is important that the AFL-CIO and some other groups have been putting pressure, and local organizers have been putting pressure to get the police unions out of the bigger unions. Remember, that won't necessarily change anything about the police union, the individual police union's power, but it will mean that they're no longer protected by the union writ large. And why that matters is the AFL-CIO is a really good example, is that because they often represent firefighters and EMTs as well, the police will package these laws to be firefighter and EMT and police laws. So Texas has a law that protects the police, but the law protects the police and firefighters together. So people don't even register it as a police law because the way they lobbied put it with firefighters and like who's complaining about firefighters. So, you know, I'm interested in that. And the last thing I'll say is that it's not just the big cities. Kenosha, the police union contract in Kenosha is just as bad as in a big city.
Well, thank you. And it turns out that the next question is actually for you, D-Ray. And the question is, you've talked about the tension between hope and the exhaustion of activism. The questioner is curious about where our panelists find kernels that make them optimistic in the current climate. Do you have any comment on that, D-Ray?
Yeah, the thing that gives me the most radical hope is that this is a moment where I've seen people who never considered themselves an activist or organizer or still don't. I've seen people do things that they didn't believe they had the power to do. I've seen people like find their power, find their voice, press, fight, like in a way that is scalable, is amazing. Like that is the thing that gives me the most hope. I've been in rooms with people who press and offer solutions where I'm like, ooh, I studied this for a long time. And like, they offered something completely new and interesting and beautiful. So that gives me hope. If there's anything that I'm always interested in like how we think about progress. And I think that there are a lot of people who think that the win is like shifting the conversation. And again, we have lived through that enough that when you think about the arc of civil rights, the police is one of the only institutions that has not changed. So we've gotten some good wins on some other things, not all wins, right? Like, but when we think about this arc, it's like the police have only gotten more power over the decades, not less.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and good comprehensive answer. The next question is for Dr. Green, and the question is, well, it's actually a comment combined with a question. Many have been comparing the 2020 protests to the 1968 civil rights movement, but those comparisons are quite superficial, and in reality, the issues go much further back than that. Why is it important for people to understand that these conflicts are a development in the American fight for racial equality, and how can we help people come to the understanding, to this understanding? And that's for Dr. Green.
Well, so I'll just make a quick comment on that. I'm sure that all of us can contribute different sorts of perspectives that would illuminate that. Clearly, and I think you said this in your introductory remarks, Dr. Henderson, we're talking about a tradition that certainly spans this century, and I think goes back to some degree, not only to the post-emancipation context, but the emergence of the founding of Free Black Press, of the organizing and the lead organizing of Black abolitionists in the North in relation to fighting slavery, the speaking circuits that included folks like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and others. So indeed, I mean, it's important to have a long frame. I'm going to make one pitch, though, for understanding why the comparison back to the 60s, to this moment now, is still very critical. And that is, while African Americans have had a long tradition of struggling for their freedom, struggling to assert and claim and exercise their rights, I think what the place of the state, what the place of the government in the United States is to this dynamic is something that obviously took a different turn in relation to the 60s, not because of the benevolence of the government, but because of the ingenuity and the power of leverage that movements were able to engage against the state to extract concessions like the 64 Civil Rights Bill, the 65 Voting Rights Act, and the like. And as DeRay McKisson just said, the question of where police and law enforcement and the reiteration of order within cities, particularly northern cities, the ways in which that was largely unchanged through this period, so that the Watts Uprising, for instance, in 1965, was precipitated by an act of excessive police force and violence. Many of the rebellions and disturbances that took place in '68 and afterwards similarly had to do with the precipitating effect of police violence. Those people that know the history of the Black Panthers know of the death of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark at the hands of police in December of 1969. They were two of over 60 African Americans who were shot and killed by the police in the year of 1969, which, as I understand it, was the worst year for police violence in that city, which has a particular history of violence in relation to police treatment of African Americans. So this question of increasingly recognizing that the state simply cannot be trusted to reform itself. There needs to be the concentration of movement energy to compel the public to recognize that the state has to be forced, and then after being forced to concede and change, be held to account in such a way that those kinds of abuses can't change. I think that targeting and focus on state action and state violence is something that means that we have to think about the relationship of this moment back to the 1960s.
All right, point well taken. Thank you so much for that. I hope everyone takes that to heart. The next question again is for Dr. Abdullah, and it comes from the Philippines. And the question is, can you make suggestions to journalists in the Philippines or other countries for how they can contribute to the campaign against racial violence? Again, this is a question from a Philippine journalist. Dr. Abdullah?
Sure, I'm really, really glad you asked that question. One of the things that we see happening a lot of times with journalists is, I know your jobs are hard, but I think that oftentimes journalists are kind of taking the easy way out by just basically printing or running the PR narrative from policing units, from governmental units, without really doing the digging that needs to be done. So here in Los Angeles, we often see things printed out of this massive PR unit. LAPD has 70 sworn officers on its PR team, not to mention its civilian staff, right? So that's the size of a large PR firm. And just for context, Black Lives Matter, I know there's all this conversation, and I repeated that we are the largest movement in global history at this point. But it's really important to understand that another thing that makes us unique is that we are just regular people. So I'm telling my kids, don't come in this room right now because this isn't my job, right? I have a whole nother job. I'm not paid for this work. We don't have a PR team. We don't have a research team. We're just regular people. So for us to have to push back against something, and this is just LAPD, that is the size of a large PR firm, is very, very difficult. And so we need journalists to be the best journalists, to dig, to do research. When PR comes out saying we're going to charter, as Black Lives Matter is saying, defund the police and reimagine public safety, and we get a mayor who stands behind our words, reimagine public safety, and announces the chartering of a new permanent police bureau called Community Safety Partnerships, don't just go with the PR narrative that they release. Ask us how we feel about it, and is this what we mean when we say reimagine public safety? So that's, I know it's a long answer, but I really want to encourage you to do real work of real journalism and dig and research, and don't just buy what people who have and institutions that have resources tell you.
Good answer. Thank you so much. Thank you. Next question is for, again, Dr. Green. It focuses on where you are right now, Chicago, and it says Chicago is famously the site of the original Rainbow Coalition, wherein some members of the white working poor put aside their ethnic divisions and joined Black Chicagoans in attempting to improve their treatment and economic opportunities in that city. Is something like that even possible in Trump's America? Dr. Green?
Well, again, I can only speak to Chicago. I'm sure that both Dr. Abdullah and Mr. McKisson have something to say in relation to this, but the short answer is yes.
A Chicago question.
It's a Chicago question. The short answer is yes. Let me give an example that predates, and I think to some degree suggests a bridge between some of what we're talking about 50 years ago and what's been taking place today. Chicago is the site of the worst scandal of systematic police torture violence meant to extract confessions away from African Americans arrested. A sergeant who eventually became a commander, and many people thought would eventually become chief of police in Chicago, named John Burge, oversaw a torture ring that likely tortured over 120, 130, according to attorneys who worked with many of the men who came forward with allegations, African Americans arrested and in most cases convicted between the early 1970s and the 1990s. And it took 20 years for eventually Commander Burge to be brought to justice on perjury charges and to have to serve time in relation to not having given truthful testimony. The statute of limitations had actually run out on being able to prosecute him in relation to his crimes against people that were arrested. And by the way, the Fraternal Order of Police was instrumental in terms of giving protection to this individual and the people that worked with him. But I'm bringing this case up because the activism that started in the early 1990s and persisted over to 2010 in terms of really bringing to light this scandal involved white journalists, involved a number of concerned white citizens within the country, as well as grassroots Black support organizing. And that was always a multiracial movement in terms of trying to bring that officer, and that officer symbolically in many ways of the larger abuses of the Chicago police force and the city that paid somewhere upwards of $120 million to be able to maintain legal protection and legal fees, both for his cases and other cases of police officers who were accused of abuse. What shone a light on that was the work of activists who are African American, but by no means not only African American. It was a coalition across the city. And I think that one of the things that's come up again and again in relation to the various demonstrations, the various marches, is that in many cases they are led, they have to do with organizations that were founded by pioneering African American organizers like the ones that are on our panel today. but they involve large numbers of whites. Trump's America does not speak for all whites. It does not speak for all Latinos. It does not speak for all Asians. It does not speak for all other people who are within this country. The unfortunate part, though, is that the ways in which votes and enfranchisement is organized within this country means that the voices of the majority are not reflected by the political expression that's possible within this country. That's probably a subject for a different panel. But I think that people looking at this from around the world should take heart in understanding that majorities in the United States have been summoned in favor of upholding this movement and upholding the claims that it's making. And we hope and we will continue to struggle in this country to show that being reflected actually in the political constitution of this country one day.
Thank you. Outstanding answer. Now, our final question is actually directed to two panelists. One is D-Ray and the other is Dr. Abdullah. And the question is, how can we direct discourse and actions to defund the police and address racial inequality in communities that may not have a large Black population when they say that this is their issue, not one in our community? That's the question. D-Ray and Dr. Abdullah, any reflections on that question?
Yeah, so it's interesting when we look at the data, we are reminded that the Honolulu Police Department actually kills a huge number of people at the rate level. So it is one of the worst police departments in the country with that regard. We just had a call with some people in Alaska. Alaska is in the top 5 states where this is a problem. So, you know, it's, again, most of the mythology around where this is most acute is actually just not true, or we have not told a good enough story. People haven't listened to the story about it being acute everywhere, right? So it's like a little bit of both of those. So when I think about Hawaii, there is definitely work. I think that the reason why we focus so much on violence that results in death is because that's the only thing that we have data on at the national level to talk about cities in comparative ways. But we know that there is so much other stuff that we aren't even quantifying. We know that women, that the trans community, the queer community is under siege by the police and they are not being killed, right? And so it's not showing up in the data. Same thing with no-knock raids. Small number of people are killed each year by no-knock raid. Huge numbers of people's lives are upended by them. And there's not an easy way to quantify those things. So when we think about defund or divest, when we think about changing accountability in places where people are like, the problem's not here, we can guarantee you that the problem is there, and we can help you think through like how you uncover the problem to tell a story. The last thing I'll say is that this is the difference between being a resident and a neighbor. A lot of people are really great residents, like businesses are good residents and really bad neighbors. So what a resident does is take care of their own place. A neighbor says like the neighborhood should just be a good neighborhood, right? Like I should invest in the school and the grocery store and like everything because like I believe in the neighborhood. And there are a lot of people in this moment, especially in elected office, and a lot of people just in society who are really good residents and really bad neighbors.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Abdullah.
Sure, I'll just add that, you know, what happens to Black people is gonna eventually happen to everybody else. So it might not be that, you know, it might be that you're not Black and so you're not worried about getting killed by the police, but if we think about cities like mine, like Los Angeles, the plurality of the people who are being killed by police are not Black people. It's Latinx folks being killed by police, right? And so you had Latinx folks or brown folks who were much more supportive of police than were Black people. And then you start to see the numbers of Latinx folks tick up in terms of police violence. And so now we're in a situation where every Wednesday we protest outside our district attorney's office, outside of Jackie Lacey's office. For 3 years, we've been saying she has to go. And it was mostly Black folks leading that charge. It was actually the twin sister of Keisha Michael, who was killed by Inglewood police, who called for this action October 25th of 2017. And we've been there every single Wednesday since. And it was mostly Black people standing there. It was 15 and 30 of us and 50 of us sometimes. And now it's hundreds of people there. And it's families, Latinx families, some of whom are also Black, who are present, right? It's families like Daniel Hernandez's family who didn't think they needed to stand up against police violence or say defund the police or say reimagine public safety until the president of the police association's daughter, who is also an LAPD officer, murdered Daniel Hernandez in April of this year in the midst of the pandemic. So it's important to remember what Lonnie Guinier says when she talks about Black people being the miner's canary. We are the miner's canary. We are the test case. We are the ones who were sent into the mine to see if it's safe to go in. And if we die in that mine, guess who's also gonna die in that mine? And so we need to make sure that it is safe, that our world is safe for Black people, because by making it safe for Black people, we make it safe for everybody else.
Thank you all very much. And I want to now thank the East West Center as we turn the discussion back over to Liz Dorn.
Thank you so much to our moderator, Dr. Henderson, and to all of our panelists today, Adam, D-Ray, Melina, Sadia, and Sienna. The East West Center was honored to have hosted this timely and informative and very important discussion. So thank you. We are very grateful. Thank you as well to all of our viewers for attending this EWC Seminars live webinar. We hope you will join us on Tuesday, September 22nd, to hear comedians Dean Obadala and Jenny Yang discuss the power of satire in combating bigotry. And to everyone, I say mahalo and aloha.